Hello to anyone who's listening to this. It's for brevity back again with another famous five tale. Now we're going to talk about book 2, 5 Go Adventuring Again. I'm probably speaking to the void, but hey, this is fun, so I'll keep on doing it. So this book starts off at Anne and George's school. We never really get to see the boys' school in the series. Not sure why, except for a little snippet in one of the later books. But sometimes we either start off with the kids already on holidays, or oftentimes now they're either at Anne and George's school. Anne gets a letter from her parents advising that her mother has scarlet fever and her father has to isolate, so the kids can't come down to their house to stay for the holidays. I think it's probably a convenient excuse by those parents. As discussed before, it doesn't seem like they ever really spend any time with their children on holidays. They were probably also double thinking inviting both George and Timmy to stay over. So the kids have to go to good old Aunt Fanny and Uncle Quentin's place at Kieran Cottage again. Turns out the kids also need a tutor because they've all done rather poorly at school, particularly George, who basically doesn't know anything because she never went to school before. And Julian and Dick apparently were sick for a week, and so they're behind on their studies. Anne apparently, however, she's all good. She doesn't really need a tutor, but as the goody two-shoes she is, she says, she might do some lessons with them anyway. George also decides that Timmy is going to have to sit there with her all day doing lessons, which doesn't seem very fair to poor Timmy, but that's what George wants, so that's what George gets. Anne and George head off to Kieran Cottage first because the boys apparently come out of school the next day, and it's mentioned that they can't go out on the sea because it's winter time and it's too cold for them to go to Kieran Island. Basically, they will be shut up at home, study. Turns out Uncle Quentin is working on a secret book. Don't really say what the secret book is, but apparently it involves formulas. Again, not really clear what science Uncle Quentin does. Anne has a thought that secretly she doesn't want grumpy Uncle Quentin around anyway during Christmas, which is quite an unkind thought from Anne, but you can appreciate where she's coming from. The next day they go to pick up Julian and Dick from the train, and George feels a little bit left out because they completely ignore her while they greet their sister, but then everything turns out okay because George is quite a forgiving girl. There's also some mention about hijinks that happen in the boys' school, and it sounds like the boys' school is way more fun than the girls' school. We never really get any stories about the girls' school or any fun adventures they get to go on. They are expecting to have a new tutor arrive the next day, and it turns out George is really behind, but what did expect when they never sent her to school before? The new tutor is called Mr. Rowland, and the kids are expected to pick him up from the station. Not really sure why Uncle Quentin or Aunt Fanny couldn't have done it, but Uncle Quentin volunteers the children to go pick him up. Turns out Mr. Rowland doesn't like dogs. It's a good thing Timmy doesn't really like him either. Not only George is smart enough to heed this as a sign that Mr. Rowland probably isn't a very nice man, but the other kids just get pulled into his charisma, including Julian, who's supposed to be the smart leader of the group. Turns out they have to begin their lessons before Christmas, and the tutor is staying in their house. Now this seems a bit harsh. I'm not sure why the parents couldn't give them a few days because Christmas only seems to be a few days away, but they decide that they simply can't wait because they're paying this man and he's staying in their house. Also, I know it was a different time and these things often happen, but I would probably be very uncomfortable with some random man just staying in my house. But I guess maybe they got his tutoring for cheaper if they gave him food and board. Before the kids start their lessons, they're able to go down to Kieran Farm, which is a property that's rented out by George's mother. It turns out there are 2 artists staying at the farm, and Julian reveals that he actually wants to be an artist too, which is kind of surprising because Julian seems to be more of the teacher sort. He likes to boss people around and tell them what to do. And I can't really see him living the bohemian life, but he seems to believe he knows a lot about it at 12 years old. While down at the farmhouse, they find out that there's a sliding panel and a false cupboard. So then the kids spend basically the whole day bothering these old people by running around the house looking for secrets. The farmer's wife doesn't seem to mind too much, but the kids just seem to make themselves at home in people's houses and eat all their food. They're lucky the farmer's wife is so nice. While they're snooping around in someone else's property, they find a tobacco pouch and another map, or what seems to be some type of map or piece of cloth with Latin written on it. They can't really tell what it means, although Julian thinks it might mean secret way. I would have thought that Julian at 12 years old in those times would have learnt at least some Latin, but apparently he's not very good at it. For some reason, Julian gets to decide whether they ask Mr. Rowland, being their tutor, about what it means. I know they don't really like Uncle Quentin, but I'm not sure why they wouldn't go to him. And of course, I guess Aunt Fanny wasn't even a thought in their mind because, how would she know Latin? Even though I'm assuming she went to school. And I don't know about the girls' education in those days, but I don't see why they wouldn't learn a little bit of Latin. They go on a walk with Mr. Rowland, which I'm not sure why he wants to hang out so much with his kids. He's already going to be tutoring them. Maybe he could leave them alone for a bit before they have to start lessons. During the walk, he tries to make friends with Timmy, but Timmy won't take a biscuit. So Mr. Rowland gets extremely angry about this. Mr. Rowland, a grown adult, and he says Timmy is a peculiar looking dog and a mongrel. Now, understandably, George gets really upset, and she says to Mr. Rowland, he's not so peculiar looking as you, which is a burn. And this is probably where we start getting the kids talking back a lot to adults, and it increases as the novels go on. Mr. Rowland, again, a grown adult, gets very angry at George. And okay, yeah, she did say something pretty rude, but he did insult a dog just because it wouldn't take a biscuit from him. But then Mr. Rowland decides to give George the silent treatment, and the kids seem really preoccupied with the idea that George is going to spoil the Christmas holidays. So this is where I feel George probably has more loyalty to them than they do to her and Timmy. They don't really speak up or say anything to defend Timmy, who has, thus far saved them in tight situations. To be fair, Julian does try and get Rowland to call George by her preferred name, but he gets shot down. For once, an adult basically tells Julian to stay in his lane, and then he tries to convince George to be a bit more conciliatory and gives up on Mr. Rowland. They have their lessons next morning, and George sneaks Timmy under the table, and when Mr. Rowland puts his feet under there, Timmy nips his leg. Now, Timmy does seem pretty out of control. He does listen to George most of the time, but sometimes he doesn't, and I don't think it's okay for him as a grown dog to be biting people. But Mr. Rowland did insult him, so he kind of deserved it. Mr. Rowland orders that George take Timmy out, and George says to Timmy she's not surprised he bit Mr. Rowland because she would too if she was a dog. And again, wow, George is just saying it how it is. Later on, George expresses to the other children that she has a bad feeling about Mr. Rowland because he doesn't like Timmy, but also because of his lips, which she feel are thin. And Dick kind of also has a weird feeling about him, but Julian and Anne in this case are much more trusting, and Julian doesn't even seem to have any type of radar that Mr. Rowland might be sus. So Julian asks Mr. Rowland about the Latin word on the paper, and he finds out it means secret way. He then decides in his wisdom to show Mr. Rowland the map despite George's protests, because apparently George's opinion doesn't count or matter. I don't even think Julian really consults anyone else about this. He just makes up the executive decision. I guess at 12-year-old, he's old enough to boss them all around, even though it's a secret they all found and technically was on George's family's property. After they show Mr. Rowland the map, he deciphers some of the clues, and it seems that they're looking for a room with panelling that's on the west side. They then decide to tell him everything and invite him along to find the secret way. George, of course, isn't involved in any of this because she thinks it's a stupid idea, and rightly so. Ultimately, George, because again, she is probably one of the less selfish characters, despite being called spoilt, decides to pay for Christmas, but she doesn't buy Mr. Rowland any presents. I'm surprised Mr. Rowland didn't insult her or give her the silent treatment again. Christmas night, Timmy hears a sound, and then George goes downstairs and they find Mr. Rowland in Uncle Quentin's study. And Timmy attacks him because it's dark, obviously, and holds him down on the ground. And then Mr. Rowland claims he was in the study because he too heard a noise. In all the hullabaloo, Uncle Quentin comes downstairs and Mr. Rowland snitches on George because he is a bit of a jerk. Uncle Quentin decides he's going to punish George because Timmy, a dog, did what a good guard dog should do and went after someone who was sneaking around at night in the house. He decides to put poor old Timmy outside in the cold, even though it's wintertime, and freezing. Despite this happening, the other kids decide they're still going to go to Kieran Farm with Mr. Rowland. George doesn't join them because her loyalty, rightly so, is with Timmy, the dog who has actually helped the children, over an adult who seems a bit like a childish jerk. The kids don't find anything at the farm, but George does see Mr. Rowland speaking with 2 artists that were at the farm, despite him pretending when he's with the other children that he doesn't know them. Anne kind of overreacts to this, and I'm starting to suspect Anne has a little crush on Mr. Rowland because she acts quite violently and says George just likes to make up bad things about Mr. Rowland. Poor old Timmy develops a cough while he's stuck outside in the cold, and so George makes a real effort to be good all day. But despite that, Mr. Rowland still convinces Uncle Quentin to keep Timmy outside, and Anne for once develops a backbone and calls him horrible. Despite that, Uncle Quentin says Timmy has to stay outside another week, and he doesn't even address Anne calling Uncle Mr. Rowland horrible, and it's mentioned multiple times that Anne is his favourite niece, and he wishes George was more like her, which is kind of mean. He gets the children thinking of him as weak and unkind, but it's likely that Uncle Quentin is flattered Mr. Rowland is interested in his work, and he seems to be sharing his formulas with him despite everything being top secret. In the night time, George decides stuff this and brings Timmy in and puts him in front of the fire in Uncle Quentin's study and rubs some oil on his chest because George is a good egg and actually loves her dog. George then decides the next day she's not going to bother to go to lessons because what's the point? No matter how well she acts, Mr. Rowland isn't going to like her and she doesn't like him, and he's being rather horrible to Timmy. Again, Julian asks her not to spoil the holiday, and I'm not sure why all the responsibility is on 10-year-old George not to spoil things when Mr. Rowland is a grown adult and he's being rather petty and mean to a little girl and her dog. Uncle Quentin bursts in on their tutoring session and says that someone has taken 3 important papers from his study and broke some test tubes. Again, not too sure what Uncle Quentin's doing in there, but it's likely dangerous, and he's got his child and wife and nephews and niece over with him, but Uncle Quentin don't care. Anne, who knew that George had snuck out last night and gone into the study, is a little weak baby and bursts into tears, but at least she doesn't tell them about George. George comes in later and Mr. Rowland starts asking her questions, and George says she'll answer her father's questions, not his. Again, George is just coming hard and fast here with the comebacks. Surprisingly, Uncle Quentin does believe George when she says that she didn't touch any of his things, but still thinks George needs to be punished because she didn't attend her tutoring session. He doesn't really know what to do with George though, so he goes to Aunt Fanny for advice, and I suppose Aunt Fanny decides George is to be sent to bed and she can't see Timmy for 3 days. While George is sitting in the study waiting for Uncle Quentin to decide this, she realises that it might be Uncle Quentin's study that holds the key to the secret way because of the panelling over the fireplace. And she also figures that maybe Mr. Rowland is the one who stole the pages from the study because Timmy didn't bark, and he would only not have barked if it was someone who was inside the house. So George convinces Julian to follow Mr. Rowland, and he goes out at night. I'm not sure why Uncle Quentin and Aunt Fanny have no idea what these kids are doing, and they're just wandering around in the dark in the middle of the night with no one noticing. Julian follows Mr. Rowland and sees him talking to the 2 artists he supposedly doesn't know, and he figures out he handed over the pages from Uncle Quentin's study. The children can't do much about it because the next day they're snowed in, and poor Timmy is still left outside even though it's snowing to high heaven and the pathway is blocked. But luckily the cook, Joanna, who actually has a heart, allows Timmy inside and keeps him in the kitchen. The kids decide that they're going to try and find the secret way in Uncle Quentin's passage because he has to go out and dig snow. So to get out of having to do any work, they pretend that they're studying when they're all along deciding that they're going to go down to the secret passage. Uncle Quentin seems kind of upset that they don't want to dig snow with him. I'm not sure why he thinks that's something children want to do, shoveling snow all day. While the adults are occupied, their kids go into the study and they find the secret passage. And as per usual, the kids just go down this secret dark passage without even thinking. Have no idea where it leads, no idea what is down there, but just decide, hey, why not? Conveniently, the passage opens up into the cupboard that had the false back, and that's one of the artist's rooms. The kids decide while they can, they're going to try and search for those pages. And then they hear the artist coming back, and the Brain Trust decide to lock the doors, even though that's going to be very suspicious, and continue to search for the papers. And eventually they figure the artists are going to break down the doors, so they try and escape. And while they're escaping, George figures out that the papers are in one of the men's coat pockets. The Brain Trust again didn't think to search there first. The kids almost get away, but then Timmy gets worried about George and starts howling, and the men hear them and they find the secret passage. So the kids are running away from these two grown men. Yet again, grown men are chasing these four kids. And on the way, of course, predictably, Anne twists her ankle and is helpless. So George, who is a loyal and sacrificial person, says she'll stay back with Timmy and scare the men away. George seems pretty confident the men don't have a gun. I don't know why she thinks that, but she seems to be willing to put Timmy's life on the line a lot. So do all the kids. They don't seem to have a lot of regard for the fact Timmy is only a dog. He's not a superhero. Luckily, the men do get scared and run away from Timmy because he's a little hellhound. The kids come up to the study. They find Uncle Quentin and Aunt Fanny there because the kids don't really have regard for safety, so all they did to cover the big hole in the floor was put carpet over it. And while Aunt Fanny went in the study to dust, of course, she almost fell and broke her neck. So that was nice of you kids. They tell their story to Uncle Quentin and Aunt Fanny, and surprisingly, Uncle Quentin actually apologises, and George easily forgives him because, again, George seems to be actually the nicest character, even though she's painted as the most unreasonable main character. Mr. Rowland conveniently wasn't well with a cold, and he's up in his room, so they decide to just lock him up there and leave him there. They call the police, and then when the two men come through the passage, Timmy holds them off and they herd them into the room and also lock them in there with Mr. Rowland. So now they have 3 criminals in their home locked in a room. The police come out and it turns out they can't take them away for another 2 days. So for 2 days, these guys are just in this room in the family home with the kids, Uncle Quentin and Aunt Fanny. The police do say they handcuff the men and leave them some food. So I guess the men are just sitting there with handcuffs on in a room, not really sure what they do for toilet. Hopefully there is one attached to that room. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty big cleanup. Probably Aunt Fanny won't do it though. She'll get Joanna too. At the end, even Julian admits he was wrong and George was right all along, which is kind of nice, I guess, for him to do because it's not usual. And that's how we leave them at the end of the second Famous Five book. This one had a pretty nice story. It's adults versus kids, and the idea that usually appeals to young children having to group together against an adult foe. Although it's unfortunate that poor George was the only one who really got Mr. Rowland's number and everyone else was just acting like George was being unreasonable, even though George is a child and Mr. Rowland was pretty horrible to her and her dog. And also it was George's house too, so he could have been a bit nicer to her. Also unclear what happens to the passageway between Kieran Cottage and Kieran Farmhouse. Are they just popping down there and annoying the old people? I wouldn't really put it past them. They'd probably go do that and demand that the farmer's wife makes them lots of food. It does take an army to feed these children. They do eat a lot. The verdict is, were the kids terrors or heroes in this book? I think they were heroes, and that's basically because Mr. Rowland doesn't like dogs, and so he must 100% be a villain. Hope you enjoyed, and I might be back next time with another regaling adventure of Famous Five. See ya.